Chapter 385. Next time, make sure your ambassador doesn't kill us. Tuesday, October 8, 1996. Iade, Embasilandan United Kingdom Princess Diana couldn't tell whether Cirrus Trelawney was right in this case. The former Hogwarts instructor had predicted that she would meet someone tall, dark, and handsome. The man standing before her was certainly dark, and he wasn't particularly unattractive for his age. However, there was tall, and then there was tall. She had stared at Hagrid in amazement when he had come in and announced that several members of a wizarding alliance, known as the Gulliver Consortium, had decided to introduce themselves to the Muggles on a limited basis. These countries would still be protected from Muggle visits without explicit permission from the ruler. However, the fact that they were coming out to begin with was a big step. She had been even more amazed when had Hagrid told her and the rest of the Regency Committee why they had chosen Britain for their first contact. Apparently, the events Jonathan Swift recounted in Gulliver's travels had actually taken place. Lemuel Gulliver, a Briton, had apparently been a friend of Swift's, and Gulliver had told Swift about these adventures firsthand. Although Gulliver's experiences had been sensationalized somewhat by the time they made it onto the printed page, and modified to satirize the British government to some extent, they were in fact a factual documentary. The half-giant had warned the Regency Committee to be prepared for a request for compensation for virgin soil diseases. The consortium nations had apparently all banded together after Gulliver had visited their islands and brought virgin soil diseases to the local populations. Although the devastation had not been as bad as it had been in the New World, thanks to the use of magic, and the fact that many of the inhabitants were not Homo sapiens sapiens, about half the populace had perished within a few dozen years of exposure. Diana didn't know how exactly they would be able to pay for this disaster, since almost 300 years had elapsed since Gulliver had set sail. She'd think of something, however. Maybe she'd give them Muggle technology. Flanked by Flamel, Hagrid, and the rest of the Regency Committee, Diana looked around the room. She had to admit that she hadn't seen a more unusual group of people in her entire life. The man in front of her was a good meter and a half taller than Hagrid, tall enough that he had almost had to squat to make it into the room. Flamel introduced him as Prime Minister Talivan of the Kingdom of Brobdingnag, the homeland of the giants and of the initial settlers of Atlantis. Next to him was a woman maybe 30 centimeters in height with fluttering gossamer wings. Hovering in midair, this second visitor was roughly the size of Talivan's middle finger. Flamel told the Regency Committee that this little woman was Queen Lysith of the Kingdom of Lilliput. Diana's eyes widened, and she looked at the rest of the members of the Regency Committee. Brobdingnag they hadn't recognized at first. Lilliput, on the other hand, was well known from Swift's book. The diminutive woman nodded. Speaking in what appeared to be an archaic form of English, she said, "Ah, ladies and gentlemen, I see you recognize the name of my country from Gulliver's reports." Diana looked at her. "Gulliver." "Lemuel Gulliver, madame. The man who visited our islands and brought death and destruction to our people. The Gulliver Consortium consists of people who were weakened by Gulliver's diseases and banded together for protection." Flamel turned to Diana and cut in. "Princess, all they know is that a Muggle whose name was bastardized over the years into Lemuel Gulliver arrived on their islands, left, and got everyone sick. They don't realize that Gulliver was an explorer who hadn't intended to get anyone killed." Talivan looked Flamel and nodded. "So I've been told, Minister. Had we known that at the time, it would have made a big difference. Unfortunately, we can't change the past. To make a long story short, we figured that the Muggles had done something to us and decided to keep ourselves away from them. We had thought that our isolation in the Pacific would make it so we didn't need to bother with protectors. Unfortunately, that was not the case. We hadn't expected you to reach us so quickly." Prince Andrew frowned. "Protector," Flamel explained. "A device which makes the island invisible anyone other than wizards and inhabitants. They've been using that ever since and have been hidden from the rest of the world as a result, with one unfortunate exception. Andrew saw it immediately. Howiehamland. Now that I think about, there were Howiehamnums in that book. The centaur representative nodded sadly. I'm afraid so, Your Highness. I'm President Nihim of Howiehamland. We hadn't intended to expose ourselves, but things happened. Our experience with the exposure, not to mention the climate change problems, has convinced the rest of the Gullivers to tell everyone we're there, but not to actually expose our territories. Admission for foreigners and Muggles will be by invitation only. Diplomats and heads of state, of course, will have free access. Taliban began introducing the rest of the people. This over here is High Priest Utler Roman III of Laputa. Laputa is described as flying city in the book. However, it's actually an archipelago where the wizards spent a lot of time flying from one island to the other. I gather that Gulliver saw all these brooms in the air and figured there was a city up there. Andrew's eyebrows shot up. You're the chaps who have rocked the world with your discovery of magical seawalls. Utler beamed with pride. That is indeed the case, Your Highness. Let's hope that there will be many more cases where the magicians in the consortium will be able to help Muggles. Amen to that, Your Excellency. The rest of the people here are the first citizen of Zelenda. Zelenda, the blokes up in the North Pacific. You're also part of this group. I don't remember you mentioning this consortium earlier when you started talking to the Americans. The first citizen nodded. Indeed, Your Highness, we are members of the consortium. We couldn't divulge information about other consortium members without permission after all. They hadn't come out yet. That will change now. How come Gulliver didn't mention your people, first citizen? The Xylendan chuckled. Simple. He was here all right. But we obliviated him before he got off the island. You'd be surprised how far that man got and how many countries never made it into the book. I see. What about places like Lugnag and Balnibarbai? The first citizen pointed at the bearded man next to him. They're around, all right. Lugnag is the empire of the werewolves, and the Secretary of State is right over here. Balnibarbai's another small state. Andrew grunted. You've got a country full of those creatures which attacked those people on the boat and in the football stadium. Yes, Your Highness. The place shuts down during full moon, and everyone is forced to stay indoors. Diana watched as the rest of the ambassadors described their nations. She could have sworn Spedano was a town in Italy, and Dallanus was probably some Greek general. Then again, what the hell did she know? She was a Muggle. Once the final ambassador finished his description, the diplomats stepped aside as an old but powerful man apparated into the room. He introduced himself as the premier of the Gulliver Consortium, the head of its Senate. The premier shook the hands of the British leaders and then brought out a piece of parchment with a map of the Pacific. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the true map of the Pacific. Let it be known that you are now allowed to print it in any Muggle textbooks as you see fit. Diana looked at it in awe. No wonder the Pacific was so big and devoid of land masses, Premier. They've been there all the time, only hidden. Exactly, Princess. Are there any other lands which aren't on this map, sir? The Premier shook his head. I cannot confirm or deny that, Your Highness. I'm sorry. Diana nodded. I should have known. I apologize, sir. No offense taken. To be honest, you've been reacting to this better than we expected. It seems that this second contact, so to speak, is going to be much more successful than our first one. Unless I'm very badly mistaken, we won't get sick again if we contact you right. Flamel nodded. I believe so, Premier. Your people have acquired immunity to our diseases now. Good. It's time to open diplomatic relations once and for all and start exchanging ambassadors for cultural exchange purposes and so forth. Since we're already familiar with your nation, we'll go through you for the time being. If other nations want to contact us, tell us, and we'll start talking to them as well. Flame will nod. I agree, this would be beneficial to all. The question is whom we're going to appoint as ambassadors to your nations. There aren't many giants, centaurs, and so forth in Britain. The premier shrugged. There are enough, I assume. And you've certainly got more werewolves thanks to that disaster in the sports arena. For all we know, Harrison Cooper could become the ambassador to Lugnag, either him or Severus Snape, the man who invented the wolfsbane potion. Flamel looked at the floor. Professor Snape was killed in the Death Eater attack, Premier. However, Harrison Cooper could be a possibility. I don't know how good he is at diplomacy, but at least you know who the man is. Good. Any ideas about the rest of us, especially the human nations? Flamel thought for a moment more. Suddenly, he smiled slyly. Actually, we might. I'll have to check with the people involved and do some research in the Muggle genealogical libraries, but there may be a set of ambassadors who would make a lot of sense, even though they likely don't know it. Really? Who are you thinking of? Flamel smirked. You're already familiar with Lemuel Gulliver, I take it. Yes, he has a bad reputation, but unless I'm badly mistaken, he didn't mean any harm, and the diseases would have stricken us as soon as anyone from Europe came here. Exactly, Premier. Well, it's about time that Gulliver came back and apologized for his actions. Taliban gaped at him. Lemuel Gulliver is still alive. That's impossible. Flamel's grin widened. Oh no, Prime Minister, Gulliver himself isn't alive. However, his descendants probably are. Chapter 386, Ambassador from Mars. Wednesday, October 9, 1996, Jacksonville, United States of America. The phone rang in Linda Warren's house. Shoving all of the spacesuit-clad NASA scientists out of the way, and barely resisting the temptation to shrink them, she picked it up. Linda, this is Christine Woodard from NASA. We've got some exciting news here. Really? What's that? The Portkey returned from Venus about 2 hours ago. Considering where it's been, it's not in bad shape. The outside looks like it's been partially melted and scratched up, but it looks like the seals are still intact. Thank God for your spells. Linda smiled. At least one of the missions had gone as planned. Thank him indeed. Are there rocks in there? I would assume so, considering that the Portkey is a good 80 kg heavier than it was before. That's great. What type of rocks do you have in there? And were you able to get an air sample? We haven't opened it up yet. We're waiting for you at this point. When you're dealing with 90 atmospheres worth of pressure at high temperatures, you really don't want to make any mistakes here. We're fairly certain that the trip through space gave the box a lot of time to cool off, but we're not taking any chances. Won't the drop in temperature reduce the pressure inside the box? You know, PV equals nRT. Quite possibly. However, a drop from 700 K to even 350 K, the temperature at arrival, is only going to get you down to 45 atmospheres or so, which is still nasty. Do you really want an exploding sulfuric acid bomb? Linda chuckled. No, I don't really. Put it in the freezer or something like that, and reduce the temperature and pressure further before you open it. Yes, some of the stuff in the atmosphere is going to condense, but that should only contaminate the top layers of the rocks, and we'll be able to figure out what came from where pretty easily. Once the temperature has dropped a lot, we should be able to open it, sample the atmosphere, and take the rocks out. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by, I'm not sure how well that's going to work, but cooling the box before extracting the atmosphere is probably a good thing to start with. How are you doing over there? Linda looked out the window and could see the glimpses of suited technicians and flickers of blue light from the police cars blocking off the streets. The entire driveway had been sealed off in a huge plastic bubble which had drawn several curious passers-by before the police had shooed them away. Someone with a bullhorn told everyone to stay inside as she replied, It's a zoo here, as you would expect. Although the scientists are convinced that nothing contagious is going to come back with the box, it's better to be safe than sorry. Woodard cut her off. Is that a police siren I hear? Good God, you've got the police involved with this. Yes, Christine. When you're dealing with possible extraterrestrial life arriving on Earth for the first time, you have to take lots of precautions. The cops have already had to throw out lots of reporters and neighbors. We don't want people walking away with any of these samples until they've gone through a full quarantine and inspection. Woodard chuckled, and I thought the samples from Venus were going to be problematic with the high temperatures. I should have known. Linda's reply was cut off abruptly when a brilliant light suddenly emanated from the plastic bubble. It vanished less than a second later, and in its place was a large box containing the world's first rocks from the floor of Vol's Marineris on Mars. Scientists in hazmat gear inside the bubble began hovering over and inspecting the container as Linda found her voice once more. Telling Woodard that the Mars Portkey had arrived, she hung up and joined the flood of scientists heading into her den, which had been converted into an impromptu control room. Photographs had been removed from the walls and replaced with computer screens, and the sofa had turned into something out of a Muggle science fiction movie. The man in charge of the arrival team nodded to her as she came in. "They're doing the preliminary tests right now, Ms. Warren. Temperature of the box exterior is about 262 K 12 Fahrenheit. It still appears to be intact, albeit scratched up a little." "Are there rocks in there?" "Yes, ma'am. Mass appears to have gone up by about 100 kg. This announcement was followed by a loud cheer. One person promptly sent off an email message saying that the Mars rocks had come in. "Is there any sign of life in the rocks?" The scientist pointed at the screen. "They're drilling into it with a sterilized probe right now to sample the atmosphere and get a few pictures. Give us a few minutes." The wait seemed endless. Finally, a grainy black and white photograph appeared on the television screen. It looked like a bunch of rocks to Linda. Then again, she wasn't an astronomer. She wouldn't have been able to tell apart the moon rocks, the Venus rocks, and these rocks. Someone at a computer console suddenly turned to the mission director. "Sir, we've got atmosphere in there. Primarily carbon dioxide, as expected. Air pressure 0.011 bar." The mission director frowned. "That's pretty high. However, that's somewhat understandable given that this sample was taken from a deep valley. Any signs of oxygen, methane, or other biomarkers?" The computer operator looked at his terminal for a few moments and then shook his head. "No, sir. The air composition of the sample matches what would expect of a sample without life. Do you want us to extract the air now, sir?" The mission director thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Take out 0.001 bar and 0.001 bar only. If there are any life forms in there which need atmosphere to breathe, a drop of 9% shouldn't kill them. Did the technicians bring the cooling devices into the bubble in time?" The computer operator nodded. "Yes, sir. They're in the process of cooling the sample back down to standard Mars temperatures right now. I don't see how any life forms could have survived all that time in space, but we can always hope." Linda was amazed at the care the scientists were taking to not kill any organisms living in the rock, if there were any. Looking around the room, she asked if the rocks seemed unusual at all. The mission director shrugged. "We won't know until we dig into them. They look reddish, as we would expect from the surface of Mars. Judging from these preliminary observations, I would suspect that there are no living organisms. They're at least organisms that we would recognize as life. Whether there are fossils or not, however, is an open question. There's also the possibility of creatures living inside the rocks, but that's less likely." One of the other technicians whistled. Pointing at his own monitor, he said, "Well, this looks interesting. I think we've got small crystals in there. They're round. I don't know if they're hematite or not, but they're the right color." Linda looked at him and frowned. "What is hematite?" The mission director turned to her. "It's a compound which only forms in water. If these crystals are made of hematite, that's a strong clue that water carved Valley's Marineris." She then asked the obvious question, "Could they be alive? Are they moving?" The mission director looked at her in astonishment for a second and then spun to the second technician. That's a good point. Like I said, we have no idea what Martian life would look like, or even if it would produce methane or oxygen. Well, Bill, is anything moving in there? The technician turned to the screen a little longer, then looked back. No, sir, nothing's moving. How big are these crystals? About 200 microns across, sir. Do they look inorganic to you? Yes, sir. However, like you said, we don't know if Martian life even uses the same stuff we do on Earth. With your permission, I'll ask the technicians down there to grab a few of them for further study before they start unloading the rocks. The mission director nodded. Permission granted. Good thinking. Linda watched as the technicians continued their preliminary investigation of the Mars rocks. Eventually, as the sun was setting, they made their way out of the bubble's airlock and stood next to Linda as she brought out her wand. She waved her wand and watched in satisfaction as the larger box placed around the portkey sealed itself and the huge plastic bubble shrank and wrapped itself around the larger box to provide an additional layer of protection. Wondering what wonders were going to come out of this, she got into her suit, went over to the box, put her hand on the handle, and apparated it over to NASA's Mars Quarantine Lab. Chapter 387. Well, she asked for it. Thursday, October 10, 1996. Henrique's residence prayer, Cape Verde, Atlantis. DEFCON status, 509% P. Raoul Henriques had gotten much more popular over the past few months. After all, he had been to Nestor and had gotten to hang around with, and in one case actually fool around with the most beautiful women on the planet. Granted, they weren't entirely Homo sapiens sapiens, but they were close enough for government work. He'd submitted several photographs of the Nestorian reception party to the newspaper, only to have them returned, as several other men had apparently thought of the same idea and gotten their pictures in beforehand. Playboy had refused as well, arguing that although the women were certainly attractive enough to serve as models for the magazine, publishing the photographs in what was in effect a first contact situation could cause readers to assume all the inhabitants of Nestor were party-crazed sluts. They recommended that he try submitting again in a year or so. Fortunately, one of Pryor's major fashion and nightlife magazines had agreed to publish some of the photographs. Henriques suspected that the villa would be influencing fashion choices throughout the country for the next few months. He had to admit that the photographs didn't do the women justice, particularly Gabrielle, the one he'd dallied with. Even the few dynamic photographs of the women which had made it into the newspapers hadn't done the job. Although all of them had been absolutely gorgeous, he wasn't as overpowered by her presence as he had been in real life. Could there have been a spell involved which couldn't be translated through photography? Nevertheless, the photographs had been good enough to have a lot of men come over to visit his house and/or interview him. Oddly enough, several of them had asked him for advice on picking up women. How was he supposed to respond to that? He hadn't done anything. He'd just arrived on the island and, well, swooned. If anything, they'd picked him up. There had to be magic involved, but as a Muggle, he hadn't been able to pinpoint it. He turned back to the television set, where the broadcasters were still debating whether the apparition in Jerusalem had been an angel. Now it was 9-1 in favor of a wizard, though oddly enough Mikkel Oved, the Israeli minister of magic, didn't know anything about it. A couple of spacecraft had returned from Venus and Mars bearing rocks, and pictures of a desolate plain had been sent back from the surface of Venus. The Mars rocks were being treated with extreme care due to the possibility of organisms living in the rocks, though a preliminary investigation indicated that their rocks showed no signs of life. The Russian Minister of Magic had started an investigation into the attack on the school in England, and Anastasios Dialynis, the wizarding ambassador to the United Nations, was supposedly about to make a major announcement. It took the announcer a good 10 minutes to get through the headlines and reach the weather and football scores he had been hoping to see. Hoping to see how his bets had come out, he paid close attention to the TV set. Of course, that was when a loud noise suddenly distracted him, as if someone was tapping on his window. Confused, he turned to the window and saw something which appeared to be an owl, staring at him and hooting. In the owl's claws was something which appeared to be a piece of paper. It almost looked as if the owl was trying to get in, but that couldn't be possible. He stared at the animal, and the owl hooted some more and began waving its leg. Wondering if the wizards had something to do with this, he picked up a book to use as a possible club, walked over to the window, and opened it. Henriques found he had no reason to worry, however. The owl swooped into his house, dropped the piece of paper in his hand, and stood on the windowsill patiently, apparently waiting for something. Now that the document was in his hand, Henriques saw that the document looked more like a piece of parchment than a piece of paper. Wondering what this was, he unrolled it and began to read Dear Mr. Henriques. This message is from Gabrielle, the woman you slept with during your visit to Nestor. I hope you are doing well and enjoyed your visit. The government appears to have liked the response to your visit and is thinking of planning another one. My personal guess is that President Markali wants some action, but she's never going to admit it. I'm writing to inform you that there's been a bit of a complication. Remember that when you met me, I had drawn a little star on my head, indicating that I wanted to fool around. It turned out that there was a very good reason I was in the mood for fun. I'm pregnant. My cycle had come early, and I hadn't realized it. You're going to be a father, and I'm researching lots of herbal remedies and spells for morning sickness. Trust me, Mr. Henriques, you don't want morning sickness. We can already assume it's going to be a girl. The fact that we've gotten through a full month of the pregnancy means that it couldn't have been a boy, as full Vila lose boys in the first few weeks of pregnancy. Our gestation period is about 39 weeks, 1 week shorter than Homo sapiens sapiens. That should put the birth somewhere in early June 1997. Henriques looked at message in disbelief. What the hell was he going to do now? He could barely support himself. Now he had a kid to deal with. He vaguely recalled the Nestorian women claiming that they took care of kids born to Muggles. But shouldn't he at least do something to help, especially with the statute of secrecy down and Nestor open to visits? The letter contained, I know this comes as a surprise to you. It certainly came as a surprise to me. I don't know if you have had any children before, but this is my first. I'm excited, needless to say. However, to be honest, I have no idea what in the name of the 5 gods I'm supposed to do. Some people have told me to get rid of the baby if I don't think I'm ready to be a good mother. I'd prefer not to do that, however. Remember that each city allows reproduction only for a month or so each year. If I turn down this opportunity, I'll have to wait another year. At any rate, I'm thinking of keeping this unexpected surprise. However, it would be inappropriate to make this decision without you. Do you want me to keep the child? You will get visitation rights, of course, if I go along with this. I won't be able to come to you, as I still can't leave the island. Vila usually give their children Muggle names, and I was thinking either Stephanie or Felis. I've told the owl which delivered this message to stay around so he can relay your response back to me. Do you want me to go along with this? Vila often raised children communally, which provides more options. I can raise the child myself, give her up for adoption, raise her communally, or terminate the pregnancy. I would really prefer the first, but I need your input on this. Rest assured, Mr. Henriques, that if we do allow this pregnancy to proceed, you will in fact have the most beautiful child in your neighborhood. We can guarantee that. I hope to hear from you soon. Sincerely, Gabrielle Henriques stared at the owl in disbelief. Was he supposed to go over there and marry her? He was a Catholic, and he really didn't want to think about the possibility of an abortion. For all he knew, getting into a fight with her over this child could lead to a hardening of Muggle/Vila relations. Come to think of it, how did this 5 gods thing mesh with his being a Catholic? Would the child be baptized? Could he even marry her if she wasn't a Catholic? Would she convert? He was going to need to think about this, and at least talk to a few friends. United Nations, Anastasios Dialynis stood at the podium with Haydar Dagher by his side. The announcement they had been working on for a couple of weeks had finally come. Ladies and gentlemen, the International Confederation of Warlocks has studied the issues facing the world today which have eluded Muggle solutions for decades, possibly centuries. Many of these issues can be mitigated somewhat with wizarding help. However, most will need a combination of both magic and Muggle technology to resolve completely. With this in mind, Grand Mugwump Dagher and I have agreed upon the Millennium Problems, a list of tasks which Muggles and wizards all around the world should focus on together. We need to take advantage of the fall of the Statute of Secrecy to combine our forces to do things one of us could not have done on our own. The protocol for dealing with solutions to the Millennium Problems will be similar to that dealing with the British quest to determine longitude. Solutions to the Millennium Problems will be presented to a board consisting of both Muggles and wizards. If, after extensive testing and evaluation, the solution can be used safely to benefit the lives of people all over the world, the IQA will award the winner a grand prize of $2.5 billion for each problem. Dialynis had to stop for a moment as the audience audibly gasped. $2.5 billion for a reward. That was huge. He continued, "Here, ladies and gentlemen, are the list of problems. Note that the space program is not included in these goals as it has been covered by President Clinton's announcement. 1. Provide all people all over the world with adequate and safe food and drinking water, at least 1,500 calories per day. 2. Develop a new clean energy source, which will be capable of powering 90% of all Muggle technology. 3. Remove enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to revert its density to pre-industrial levels. 4. Develop a system which will protect entire nations from rising sea levels and other aspects of climate change. Note that Lapitan Lone Palt has made extensive progress in this area. 5. Develop faster than light communication and/or travel by circumventing the inability for any material object to travel faster than sea. 6. Remove 90% of species threatened by human extinction from the endangered species list. 7. Extend the average human lifespan to at least 100 years, but no more than 150. 8. Develop a program which will ensure that, for a period of no less than 10 years, every nation on Earth be at peace with every other nation. 9. Develop a program which will ensure the integrity and morality of all officials in public office. 10. Develop a program which will reduce the number of incidents of religious extremism and hatred in the world by at least 90%. 11. Develop a program which will ensure that technology and magic only be used in a fair and wise manner, for good and not for evil. 12. Colonize the seafloor, our last frontier, in an ecologically sound and safe manner. I know that these are extremely ambitious goals. However, we now have both magic and technology at our disposal. If there is any time we will be able to accomplish them, that time is now. Hurry, ladies and gentlemen. There is no time to waste." Chapter 388. Stephen Hawking Takes a Walk. Friday, October 11, 1996, Stockholm, Sweden. Atlantis, DEFCON status 5/0. 9%. Anastasios Dialynis had no idea who was supposed to bow to whom here. Usually, people in republics tended to treat him as a president, and people in monarchies tended to treat him like a king. The President of the United States had shaken his hand, and the Countess of Hogsmeade had bowed to him. But what was he supposed to do with Karl Roman 16 Gustaf of Sweden? Was the Swedish king supposed to bow to him, treat him as an equal, or what? Was Dialynis supposed to bow to Karl Gustaf? It was very rare for Dialynis to meet with Muggle monarchs. Interaction with Muggle heads of state, of course, generally didn't occur unless Atlantis was at DEFCON 2 or higher. However, prior to the events of Judgment Day, there had been only two times in the past 250 years when the world had hit DEFCON 2, the destruction of Hiroshima and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dionysus was thinking of doing the same thing the Swedish king did. If Carl Gustaf bowed, he'd bow back. The whole royal ranking protocol would have to be expanded to cover wizards. It's not like he couldn't be here. The Nobel Prizes were among the most prestigious Muggle honors in existence, and one of them honored the person who had done the most to ensure world peace over the past year. It was obvious who the winner was going to be, and everyone knew it. Several of the other nominees hadn't even shown up, and one of the two men nominated for resolving a crisis in East Timor had decided to go fishing. Stopping the fighting in East Timor had, of course, been a major accomplishment. However, the East Timor crisis hadn't involved the entire world, or nuclear weapons. Picking up the Nobel Prize wasn't the only thing he was here for. Curious about the Swedish royal family, he had looked them up and found some wizards in their family tree. Sure enough, when Prince Daniel had sent a DNA sample over to Ziggurat Labs under a pseudonym to hide his identity, the results had come back with Zeonly Wizard. That had prompted virtually the entire royal family to submit their own DNA. The current king was a Z, as was Princess Madeline. Sweden didn't have a separate wizarding monarchy. The head of the wizarding state was the Minister of Magic, 85-year-old Philip Hansen, who served in the same role in the country's government that Travis Radner had. However, the discovery that Madeline was a Zeonly witch had sent shock waves through royalty watchers. The fact that Madeline was only 11 days older than Cunley, King William had started many Swedes trying to convince Madeline to marry William and produce Muggle-born wizards. Dionysus thought the odds of this happening were low. He was currently smitten with Hermione Granger, and many of the British were trying to set him up with Laura Spencer. Wearing full dress robes over a Muggle suit, he took his seat near the front of the room as Carl Gustaf opened the ceremony and introduced the man who would announce the winner of the prize in physics. In theory, all of the prizes were supposed to have been awarded on different days. However, the circumstances were a bit unusual this year in that one man would be announcing two prizes, and he had trouble getting around. As a result, they had decided to give them all out on the same day to not stress him that much. The first award would be given out by Stephen Hawking, a famous British physicist who had taken some time off from his position as one of Hogwarts's two astronomy professors to make this announcement. Having been tipped off by Flamel, Dionysus knew what was going to happen here, and he looked around the room to see how the Muggles were going to react to this little practical joke. Hawking came out on stage in a wheelchair with his automated speech synthesizer attached nearby. His computerized voice welcomed the guests to the ceremony, gave his respects to Carl Gustaf and the royal family, and began announcing the name of the new laureate. The winner of the 1996 Nobel Prize in Physics goes to. That was as far as he got. The man who pushed the wheelchair looked surprised for a moment. Realizing that without the computer Hawking wouldn't be able to speak, he started looking around the room in consternation. That was when Hawking shook his head and chuckled. Speaking in a raspy voice still showing signs of disuse, he said, "Good riddance. I never liked the bloody computer anyway." The entire room gasped when they realized what they had just seen. They came to their feet in unison and nearly brought the roof down with thunderous applause. The man who had pushed the wheelchair, now smiling openly, reached off stage and brought out a cane. Placing it next to the wheelchair, he watched as the scientist turned his head and reached for the cane. Amazingly, the applause grew even more deafening. Making sure that Hawking was up for the next part, the man pushing the wheelchair nodded and backed off. Dionysus watched as Hawking, with the aid of the cane, got out of his wheelchair and gingerly came to his feet. The applause reached a crescendo loud enough to be heard in Helsinki. Hawking raised his free hand for silence, at which point everyone told him to drop the cane. Expecting this, Hawking shook his head. "I'm afraid not, ladies and gentlemen. I actually need the cane. Wizards aren't guards, after all. However, considering that I couldn't even move or talk earlier, I'll take life with a cane any time. Hawking scratched his head with his free hand. Where was I? Ah, yes, the announcement. The Nobel Prize in Physics goes to Innes Taylor for linking magic to a hitherto unknown form of repulsive gravity. The crowd cheered as Taylor came up and received the award. The Scotsman gave a brief little speech, but it was obvious that the man had been completely thrown off by Hawking's amazing recovery. He stammered here and there, and Hawking nodded in understanding. Eventually, he hobbled off stage for a moment, cane clicking on the floor, to give Taylor enough time to give his speech with dignity. Hawking came back on stage and resumed his speech as Taylor returned to his seat. Ladies and gentlemen, it is also my great pleasure to announce this year's winner for the prize in medicine. As you are probably aware, the emergence of magic has allowed the life sciences to do things which had never been done before, such as, say, cure my disease and rid me of that infernal voice box. The crowd laughed as Hawking continued. The ability to cure owls, however, pales in comparison to the repercussions of this latest development. Ladies and gentlemen, the Nobel Prize in Medicine goes to Dr. Michael Parsons of Britain's Ziggurat Labs for the discovery of the Q and Z genes underlying magical ability. The crowd cheered once more as the winner walked on stage to receive the award. The cheers changed to a brief laugh, however, when Parsons bowed to Princess Madeline. Madeline innocently joked with him whether he'd be passing on a date request from King William, catching both him and the rest of the royal family off guard. Hawking made it off stage on his cane as the other awards were announced. The chemistry prize went to three men who had helped discover a certain type of molecule called a fullerene. Dionysus had no idea what that was, but then again, he wasn't a chemist or even an alchemist. The prize in literature went to someone named Wisława Szymborska he'd never heard of before. Ms. Szymborska had barely beaten out Noah Pishtin for his documentary on the First Judgment Day. The economics prize went to two more people he'd never heard of before, a Brit and an American. One prize was left, the Nobel Peace Prize. The king returned to the microphone to report that José Ramos Horta would be announcing the winner. There was a brief moment of confusion, followed by major applause. It was fairly obvious what had happened. Ramos Horta had been one of the major contributors to the peace treaty in East Timor and would have almost certainly won the award had there not been a judgment day. Since it was obvious who the winner would be, the real fight was for second place, and the award would be the honor of announcing Dionysus. Ramos Horta called out Dionysus's name, and the former Grand Mugwump made his way to the stage. Looking out over the crowd, he saw everyone was on their feet. A television screen mounted on the wall featured a view of a large crowd, all of whom were coming to their feet simultaneously. The screen shifted to a scene in Paris, where everyone was doing the same thing. All around the world, people were acknowledging the most important and long-reaching magical operation in the past 3,600 years. Had it not been for Judgment Day, the world could have easily gone up in nuclear fire. He remembered that last report before time zero, a 39.1% chance of the end of civilization. Thank God it had worked. Accepting his award with a brief speech, he headed over to the royal box and saw that the king was bowing to him. Relieved that his majesty had prevented the former Grand Mugwump from making a fool out of himself, Dionysus began to bow back. However, the king shook his head. "You don't have to bow, ambassador. Not today." Dionysus frowned. "Why not, your majesty? You're the king, and we're supposed to bow to kings. At worst, you're at the same rank as I am, especially in your own land." Carl Gustaf shook his head. "Not today, ambassador. Not today. Tomorrow, perhaps, but not today." Icicle Sidade Arctic Ocean. Mab's iceberg fortress was an interesting place, but not particularly helpful in keeping one's sanity. For black god cultist Sebastian Orlov, his captivity was certainly tasking for the mind. He was the only occupant of his cell, bathed in crystal light all the time to take away his sense of time. By his estimates, he'd been there for a month. His Vila captor has pretty much declared him to be her private property and used him in ways that made him shiver in dread and horror when not in her glamorous presence. Being raised in a Chernobog cultist but otherwise traditionalist family, he didn't think highly of bondage, dominance, and S&M. Actually, screw that. What the damned bitch did to him and forced him to do unto himself was plain torture, survivable only with timely magical healing. Sebastian's whole body was a patchwork of healed and not completely healed skin, scars from various cuts, amputations, limbs reattached grown back, crushings, burning, and much more left visible just to screw with his mind. Still, the perversions of the creature had saved him from worse fates this way. The fairies, giants, and merpeople left him mostly alone. He, like many of his brethren, was lectured by wizards on many magical creatures that may cross his path in service of the Black Guard, and always wondered why they feared fairies so much. Now he knew. Fairies were apparently tiny, cute, and harmless humanoids, but judging by the things they did to him, they had disturbingly alien minds, and for some reason saw his presence as an unforgivable insult. His wizard instructors taught him these fae had strong, wandless magic, superhuman speed and agility, not to mention flight. Hearing things like, "We spare you for now, human, but once she gets bored with you, your life is ours," from them was a bad sign. But Sebastian wasn't going to wait for that day to come. When not in her presence, he already desired the Vila's death, but as soon as he saw her, it went out of his head. Once the damned female was out of the picture, he'd still have to escape the castle alone, and armed only with what he scavenged on his way out, most of his intel given by gloating prison guards. Small chance of success, certainty of death. A worthy challenge for a brother of the Black Fist, the vanguard of Chernobog's cult, and he had an idea that might just work. Later, the Vila opened the door and stepped in the cell, barbed whip in hand, and a wide array of torture implements hanging from the belt of her barely concealing outfit. A chest levitated in behind her and was lowered gently to the ground by a fairy, who exchanged a knowing, smug smile with the woman and left the room, closing the door behind itself. Turning her charms to maximum, the Vila spoke, "Come here and kiss my feet, you worthless worm." Then, as nothing happened, looked at the prisoner's bed if he was there. He was, sitting with his back turned to her and a rugged bed sheet covering most of his torso. Nothing seemed out of place. His clothes ruined and his body full of scars. The prisoner often tried to hide like this, and while she didn't remember tearing the bedsheet, she couldn't rule out that she got carried away last time. But the stupid male ignored her call and would pay for it. Swinging her whip with an audible whoosh, she stepped closer and struck at the bare back. Then several things happened in quick succession. 1. The cultist dodged to the left and back, avoiding the whip, but for a single barb slashing his right shoulder. 2. He turned around, quick as lightning, exposing his self-made blindfold and plugged nose, and got a hold of her arm and shoulder. 3. He pulled her closer, brutally headbutted her face, and crushed her nose. That was when the Vilas, wondering why the charm isn't working, were briefly stopped by the pain. 4. One hand sliding to her nape and another grabbing her jaw, the cultist then proceeded to twist the female's head sideways until her neck snapped with a sickening crunch. Disoriented by the broken nose, the Vila at the last moment tried to turn in harpy form, but only got half the way. 5. The combatants fell to the floor, and the cultist bashed the half-transformed creature's head to the floor a few times, just to be sure. It all happened in the span of a few seconds. When it was done, the only sound in the cell was Sebastian's ragged breathing, and he quickly got that under control. Silently, he reached out to his victim's neck to look for a pulse. Finding short feathers but no sign of life, he removed his blindfold and shakily stood up. It was not his first kill, far from it. To become an initiated member of the Black Fist, he had to become a killer in battle and sacrifice. But this was his first non-human victim, and a very disturbing one at that. "May the Black Guard chew on your wretched soul forever," he muttered, then began looking for suitable weapons. He took the Velar's belt with the various knives on it. Some of them were balanced enough for throwing, and all of them were still useful against the fairies out there. Then he opened the chest, compartment after compartment. He found a hammer and nails first, then a club eerily similar to a baseball bat, then, to his surprise, a Muggle chainsaw, and finally a katana. Whistling in apprehension, he settled for that one. Next, he cut the bedsheets to rags and wrapped him inside those, creating a rudimentary clothing it wouldn't do to wander out of the temperature-charmed zone half naked. Later, the fairy opened the door and looked inside, expecting the usual sight of one satisfied Velar and one barely living human. Instead, it only saw the former, motionless on the floor. As it moved closer to her, a huge shadow sprang from behind the door, and before it could blink twice, pinned it to the ground with a steel dagger piercing its wing. Feeling its power flowing away, it opened its mouth for a desperate wail, but found another dagger's point hovering a hair away from its face, and the human looking down on it. "Speak only when I ask you and answer truthfully, and I may let you live. Tell me, how do I get out of here?" The fairy didn't try to play hero. "Stairs on the right end of the corridor, 2 levels up, 3rd room to the left, cabinet of sticks. Our emergency portkeys, break them to activate." The human smirked. "Oh, smart little thing. And tell me, where will that take me?" Again, the fae was too afraid to lie. "Inscription on all sticks, location name, safe house. That would complicate things, or not. Tell me which unguarded safe house is furthest south in European Russia." The fairy told him eagerly, and tried to add a pleading, "Please don't kill me." But unfortunately for it, members of the Black Fist were taught never to leave armed hostiles behind their back, and wandless magic certainly qualified as a weapon. Feeling a little regret, the Chernobog cultist stepped out of his cell and began his way to freedom and Rasputin. Chapter 389. Radioactive Waste Disposal. Friday, October 11, 1996, Environmental Protection Agency, Washington, DEC, United States of America, Atlantis, DEFCON status. 509%. Once again, Linda Warren was at the podium in Washington, D.C. This time, however, it was at the request of the Environmental Protection Agency, which had just figured out a more creative use for her interplanetary portkeys. NASA had its hands full with the various sample return missions at the moment. The usual Apollo-era circus had erupted as various universities, labs, and billionaires had fought to get their hands on the various moon rocks. To make matter worse, the Chinese and Russians had argued that they were entitled to a substantial portion of the rocks, as well, because they had been collected by astronauts from those nations. The good news was that there were more than enough rocks to go around for each major university to get a few dozen grams. The bad news was that about 90% of the requests had been for rock, and in most cases, water samples from the lunar South Pole. There had been only about 5,600 grams of water in the container, and there was no way that each lab would be able to get a large enough sample to do much good with it. In fact, all the water had managed to do was turn the rocks into a half-dissolved muddy mess. NASA was still trying to figure out who was going to get what. The fight over the moon rocks, however, was nothing compared to the fight over the Mars rocks. Organizers were clamoring for whole rocks even though A, there weren't enough Mars rocks to go around, B, NASA hadn't even finished investigating the rocks on its own yet, and C, for the most part the requests had come from labs which did not have a suitable quarantine facility. Although it was now fairly obvious that the Mars rocks were indeed lifeless, at least on the outside, NASA didn't want to take any chances. The strange balls Linda had seen when the Mars Portkey had first been opened had been made out of hematite, as had been originally thought. The scientists now knew beyond a reasonable doubt that water had flowed in this area. The Venus rocks weren't selling as quickly for two reasons. First, there wasn't any chance of life on Venus given that 90 atmosphere pressure, sulfuric acid rain, and high temperatures. Second, the Portkey was en route back to Venus, so it could do more exploration. Several of the labs, after having been told of the second Portkey's location, had decided to wait for samples from that area. Nevertheless, most of the Venus rocks had already found new homes. Linda put Venus out of her mind as the director of the EPA motioned for her to begin her speech. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. My name is Linda Warren, and I'm in charge of the Portkey department for NASA. It is my pleasure to announce a new initiative which will help clean up our terribly polluted planet. As you know, we have been able to send Portkeys to various locations in the solar system. We've sent unmanned Portkeys to Mars and Venus and used them to send men to the moon. This time, we're heading for a bigger and hotter target, the Sun. The project is simple. The government will collect trash, recycle everything it can, and then send over everything which is considered dangerous. This includes radioactive materials, hazardous chemicals, biological samples, and so forth. These compounds will be placed inside a Portkey and sent off towards the Sun, where they will be safely disposed of. Unlike the other Portkeys, these devices are intended to be used on one-way trips. She smiled. Yes, you heard that right. We have just solved the problem of radioactive waste once and for all. Now, it's going to take a lot of Portkeys in order to get rid of everything. However, keep in mind that anything can be turned into a Portkey. Given the right safety precautions, a wizard can eschew the box altogether and turn a spent uranium fuel rod into a Portkey directly. The only danger is the possibility that the radiation could damage the wands. We're working on that for now. I'll now take some questions. Catanzaro, Italy. Don Amaranto had been snooping around in Ndrangheta territory for several days. He hadn't seen any signs of the missing wizards or any of the Ndrangheta mobsters. They had to be around here somewhere, he had thought. He just had to keep on looking. As it turned out, they had been right behind him, invisible. Something heavy had conked him on the head, and he had lost consciousness. Finally, after a long and unexpected nap, he woke up. He found himself staring at Don Christian and Don Gerardo. Breathing a sigh of relief, he asked them what was going on. Don Gerardo looked guiltily at the floor. I'm sorry, Amaranto. I have no choice. I really don't want to have to do this, but I'm under an unbreakable oath. I'm sorry. Amaranto stared at him, perplexed. What the hell is going on here? Where's my wand? A new voice answered the question. All will be explained in due time, Don Amaranto. In the meantime, I recommend that you listen to me. I have an offer that you can't refuse. Gerardo, would you do the honors? Russian Ministry of Magic. The intern's excited voice resonated in the small chamber. Minister, I think we've got her. The minister breathed a sigh of relief and turned to him. That's great news. You're sure it's the right person, though? The intern nodded. Indeed we are, sir. There are only 3 Zygonovas in the Slavic-speaking world, and considering that the other 2 are 6 and 9, I doubt it's one of them. She's 32 years old and based in Lviv. Married to E. Zygonov, age 34. Did she ever spend time in England? The intern shrugged. I can't tell, Minister. The records don't show that. The minister frowned. I was hoping we would luck out, but we didn't. Oh well. Tell the Auras to start trying to track her down, starting at her hometown. Once they find her, keep an eye on her, and make it discreet. The intern nodded. Yes, sir. MT, St. Helens facility. Sorceress Rachel Martins turned to the head of MT St. Helens and grimaced. I have no idea how that happened, Diana. I've never seen anything like this before. The head of the MT St. Helens facility shook her head. You've never heard of an engorgio manifesting itself slowly, bit by bit, over a long period of time. No, I haven't. and there's no mention of this happening in the books either. Could it be because it's radioactive? No, Diana. I told you. We'd have known about that from the engorgios filmed inside the British Ministry of Magic before the bombs went off. Those were uranium, after all. Could it be because this promethium is artificial? Supposedly it's hard to create and doesn't exist naturally. I don't know, Diana. However, I doubt it, as plastic isn't exactly natural either, and we've been able to enlarge that. Diana shrugged. Maybe because it's radioactive and artificial. Find out. Tokyo. The cop couldn't believe what he was hearing. Are you telling me that a sample of radioactive material disappeared from your lab? The woman on the other end of the line responded. Yes, sir. We looked around for a couple of weeks and didn't get anywhere. We asked everyone. Trust me, we've done everything we could. The cop made a note. I'll pass it on. I sure hope it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Can you imagine Aum's subway attack with a dirty bomb? Worse still, with a mini-nuke. Chapter 390. Millennium Problem, Angel Investor. Saturday, October 12, 1996. Pault, Residence an Island Atlantis, DEFCON status. 5/0. 9% loan. Pault looked at the document in disbelief. What in the name of all 5 gods was he going to do with 12 million galleons? The scene had been almost surreal. Shortly after Atlantis had mentioned the Millennium Problems, the High Priest had come over and told him that a representative of the Millennium Problem Board wanted to talk to him. The representative had congratulated him on his good work and announced that Pault's invention was working wonders in keeping Venice dry. He had no idea where Venice was, but that was beside the point. As long as the spell was working, that was all that mattered. The representative had decided that Pault's work had achieved part of the goals needed for the 4th Millennium Problem. Not all of them, of course, but a good part of it. As a result, the board had decided to award him 8% of the 250 million galleon prize, 20 million. After taxes, that worked out to about 12 million galleons. Considering that Pault was 59 years old, the idea of spreading the payments out over 30 years wouldn't work all that well in case he passed on in between. He had to take it all immediately as a result. The president of the Bank of Laputa hadn't initially accepted the deposit, thinking that it had to be money laundering or a scam of some sort. Eventually, Utlo Roman III himself had to tell bank officials that this was on the level. There was no way Pault could even imagine spending 50,000 galleons in 1 year. No way. Was he seriously going to consider buying a house every single year? He doubted he'd ever spent more than 15,000 in a year in his entire life, and he'd done a lot of traveling around the Gulliver consortium. He could spend some of it trying to pick up a new wife. However, he was concerned that people would start dating him for the money and not for his personality. He could buy a big new house, one that cost maybe 300,000 galleons. That still wouldn't even make a dent in it. He looked out over the ocean trying to figure out what to do. Finally, he hit upon a solution. He would keep 3 million for himself, give 2 million to his son, set aside 2 million to local philanthropic work, and place the remaining 5 million in a fund which could be used to help companies trying to solve the remaining millennium problems get off the ground. How could he keep all of the money when there were still more millennium problems to be dealt with? He wondered how many Muggle businesses would accept funds in galleons, but he supposed that the Muggle world would get around to using galleons at some point. There was even talk of making the galleon the new gold standard, though that wasn't getting anywhere at the moment. Getting involved in the millennium problems was risky, to say the least. Many people would try and fail. However, if any of them succeeded, he'd reap a huge return on his investment. Once all of them were solved, or at least most of them, he'd take 30% for himself, if he was still alive, otherwise give it to his son. Give 20% to his son regardless of what happened, and dedicate the other 50% to more philanthropic work. The money would just compound over time, making the fund larger and larger. Unless he was very mistaken, this reward would help the world a great deal. Enfield, Ma, Persephone Ariadne chuckled as she turned to the merman. I know, you can't sleep. However, it should be finished soon. You should have expected something like this would happen, especially in Massachusetts. The merman wrung his hands. All that banging and spellcasting up in North Dana, don't they realize how far sounds travel in water? Probably not. However, consider this. Kershaw is making a memorial to the attack. He's also demonstrating some magical construction techniques in an attempt to convince the mayor of Boston that he is qualified to work on the Big Dig. The Big Dig. A construction project to move a Muggle highway underground in Boston and dig another tunnel underwater. It's been going on for a while. The merman chuckled. Underwater tunnels. Merlin's beard, I could have helped with that. How are the Muggles doing it without merpeople and worms? Ariadne laughed freely now. Not very well, Jarmet. Not very well at all. Jarmet grinned evilly as he left the room. And I thought I had problems. Ha! Ariadne smiled and turned back to most recent report. The Ciudadani refugees had looked around for a new house and had eventually settled in Brighton, where many 20 and 30-somethings lived. The adults couldn't speak English well yet, and likely never would without the aid of language lozenges. However, Petunia, the little girl, was starting to pick up English as a second language. Having not yet reached the age where language acquisition became much more difficult, she was slowly starting to find herself in a position where she could serve as a last-ditch interpreter for her parents. She had even learned enough to start sitting in on some third-grade classes at the Boston public schools. All three Ciudadani were much happier in their new world, and they had slowly started to come out of their shells. There was already talk of making Petunia Círdan the American ambassador once she grew up, provided that Círdan didn't revert back to its old ways. In other news, Schwinn had teamed up with a wizard to produce a flying bicycle. Guinevere's flying carpets had gotten 5 more distributors. The Muggle Apparition Network's business was booming, and a Portkey was en route to Mercury. Rumors had leaked out about the Ford Lacewing, which had prompted Toyota and Chrysler to follow suit and introduce their own flying car projects. A witch had spoken with a fully recovered, but still retired, Radner briefly about possible wizard interference at race tracks, and she had come back with a mandate to send wizards to Wonderland, Suffolk Downs, Rockingham Park, and other horse racing venues to make sure that didn't happen. There were too many places for wizards to be there all the time. However, spot checks would likely be enough, particularly if a violation resulted in a stay in that wizarding prison in the Aleutians. The Death Eater attack at Hogwarts worried her greatly. She couldn't imagine how the Death Eater organization had survived the events of Judgment Day. From what Dialonis had told Radner, all of Voldemort's minions, save maybe 7 or so, had been taken out by Atlantis. Could those 7 have returned to England and attracted some pureblood wizards who hadn't initially been members of the Death Eaters? Fortunately, a Russian witch who had been seen in the area during the attack was now being tracked by the Russian Ministry of Magic. Hopefully, if everything went according to plan, she'd lead the Russians to the rest of the Death Eater cell. An awful thought occurred to her as she turned back to the report on Círdan. The Death Eaters were wizard supremacists to some extent. The Ciudadani were as well. If the Death Eaters and Ciudadani managed to join forces, that would be disturbing. And there were undoubtedly many disgruntled wizard supremacists in Círdan who had been angered by the sudden emancipation of their slaves. The Ciudadani report hinted at a society in turmoil. Not surprisingly, the freed Yahoos had trouble thinking for themselves, the classical slave mentality, so people tended to take advantage of them. Some of them had wound up hiring themselves out to their former masters for pay, while others roamed the countryside unemployed and had to resort to begging or crime to make ends meet. The wizards, meanwhile, had found that maintaining the tractors had been harder than they had thought and tried to call back their former slaves to keep the machines running. The slaves, of course, hadn't known how to work them either, and the former masters took them to task as a result. There were still several battalions of American soldiers running around down there, but the collapse of the economy in the wake of Judgment Day, those government couldn't risk paying for military operations like this for too long. Not surprisingly, Nestor had immediately announced that it would take in any freed Yahoo who wanted to start a new life. A good half of the men had taken Andrea Marcali up on her offer, an event which left Círdan with a dangerous gender imbalance. There were even unconfirmed rumors that polygamy had started up among the Círdani Muggles. The lottery for Muggles moving to Atlantis had been held on October 1st, on schedule, and the winners had been notified. The Muggles were in the process of making their way over and trying to accustom themselves to life on the island. A large number of blackguard cultists had joined the lottery, which had been unusual and worrisome. Fortunately, there had been so many candidates that none of them had actually made it in. The fighting in Howinghamland was finally winding down, much to the relief of virtually every wizard in the world. With the resurrection stone safely in Atlantis, the Philosopher's Stone out of the picture, and the Howinghamland conflict over, Atlantis was at DEFCON 5 for the first time since winter. It looked as if the world had weathered the Super Bowl breach and had adapted to the presence of wizards in the community. There were still some anomalies here, and their wizards disappearing in southern Italy, unconfirmed rumors about the return of Grigori Rasputin, and a missing Elder Wand. However, none of them posed enough of a threat to civilization to convince Endukaku that the odds of societal collapse exceeded 1%. She just hoped things stayed like this. Sargasso, Sea North Atlantic. Under the waves of a shoreless sea of crystal-clear waters and rootless jungles of seaweed, lay a vast and unique city of the merpeople. Sargasso was one of the most ancient of their settlements, founded by refugees after the hammer of Ra smashed Roctorattle into rubble and its inhabitants into bloody pulp. Blaming the contact with the other races for the tragedy, these refugees chose the single place on the globe where no coastal civilization was nearby, yet enough food grew for a city, the Sargasso Sea. Using the apex of their engineering knowledge, they built a whole city upon floating platforms made of balloons of rot gas and alloys forged in an enchanted deep-sea vent 3 miles underwater. If destroyed and rebuilt Roctorattle was like medieval Venice, Sargasso was like pre-Columbian Tenochtitlan. How that forge got there was a mystery, as no human wizard dived that deep, and no mention of merwizards could be found in the records. But it was all they needed to build the city where no city should have stood. In the golden ages before that time of great sorrow, the merpeople of the trading cities sponsored great expeditions and mapped most of the planet's waters, albeit mostly focusing on the coasts and the life-bearing photic zone. They built trading outposts wherever a terrestrial settlement was nearby, and outlying settlements to support those with food hunted and gathered on those feeding grounds. Ook. I need an aquatic equivalent for the word. When the Great Flood swept away the coastal civilizations, these settlements were left to fend for themselves, and in a generation, a great federation was reduced into warring Stone Age tribes. Defending the new city against their encroachments was easy, even as the building alloys proved to be lousy weapon materials. Maintaining the city's isolationist policy was not easy, for even as they lifted stone and metal from under 3 miles of darkness, Roctorattle was also rebuilt. The leader of the refugees proclaimed himself eldest, kept and strengthened his people's unity, and said that the shining city's continued association with the surface world would bring its doom again. As the years came and went, the two cities grew, but when after 5 centuries Sargassos's population capped at a meager 10-0, even as they harvested food from all over the Sargasso Sea and Roctorattle, population 30-0, steadily kept growing with a much smaller feeding ground and maintaining much higher standards of living. The eldest of Sargassos let go of the title, bowed before the eldest of Roctorattle, and humbly requested the establishment of trade relations. Sitting on his throne, thinking of those lost days of glory and stubbornness 5,000 years ago. Elder Shaga of Sargashus looked at the guests. There were 6 of them, one who could have been a Sargashan, the rest all half-breeds of various bloodlines like some Rakta Ratley, but dressed in strange clothing with lots of harnesses and pockets. None of his people had ever heard of people like these, and when they appeared out of the blue in the outskirts of his city, asking for an audience, the guards were spooked, to say the least. They hovered around the visitors, spears pointed at them, waiting for the slightest cause to stab. Looking at each other, the 6 strangers bowed curtly, and one of them spoke. "We bring greetings and offerings of peace from the wandering city of Trapananda. None of you could have heard of us before today, for our kind was hiding from the world for 5,000 years. I am Jawon of the noble and most ancient house of Tav currency, sign Archaean, and I have a proposal for you and your people." Deciding that these fellows were okay for the moment, Shaga signed to the guards to lower their spears and replied, "I am Shaga, son of Dalphius, elder of this city. You've raised my curiosity, Jawon of House Tav currency, sign Archaean, and I trust you'll answer my questions truthfully. But first, tell me of this proposal. As you are no doubt aware, many changes have come to the world in the last few months. One of those offers a new chance for greatness to our people. You are a wise man. You surely know how about 1 in 100 of your people has the ability to see things that others can't. If you have any doubt, I can assure you they see magical constructs and creatures, like the surfacer wizards see. Recently, the human Muggles have made a great discovery that 1 in 100 of their people has the power of wizards without their magical sight. Our researches indicate that it's the same for our people." The elder was shocked. "You say we have 100 merwizards in this city, all untrained and unrecognized. From what you say, I gather that their powers would be less than those of full wizards, but does that also mean that one of that 100 would also have the magic sight? In other words, wouldn't there be full wizards among us?" That was the hard part, Jawon knew. "You are right. However, perhaps you're familiar enough with the workings of the surface world to know that wizards always try to stay away from Muggles. Until recently, most people had no idea that wizards and witches even existed. For some families, that was easy, as they were all wizards, and they have lived in secrecy for hundreds of years. Others were born to non-wizards by chance, but they too went to study in their nation's magic school, embraced the wizard world, and distanced themselves from their families. Roughly 1 in 10,000 Muggle children were like that, all joining the wizards and keeping their secrets. We merpeople are very much like that, but spread out, and without large nations, we would not have enough wizards to keep the flow of knowledge uninterrupted. We will tell you our story now, Elder. Hear it and judge it if you wish, but know that it's the past, and we can only learn from its mistakes, not change them. 5,000 years ago, falling stars crushed into the sea, killing most merpeople and surfacers. A great human wizard from Egypt saved some of these people by reaching into time itself in the first Judgment Day. Back then, merpeople had wizards among themselves, who had a council where all of them were represented. This council ruled that our kind's wizards had a new destiny to preserve life even if a future Judgment Day fails. To do this, they had to keep and increase their power. Back then, they believed that mating with non-wizards would weaken their descendants, so they used the destruction to disappear from the world your ancestors knew. Another merwizard continued. These merwizards manipulated all records, obliviated all memories, under and above water. Then they all went to a place we can't show you under pain of death and built our city. They grew numerous and powerful. They used magic to change into human shape and walked the dry lands among those to get their power. They watched the surfacers, traded with them, learned from them. They saw them harm life and interfered where they could, as long as it didn't jeopardize the mission. For they had to stay hidden to keep their power, to be ready when it counts. The one who looked just like the natives spoke next. But every now and then, merwizards and merwitches were born to parents of the 1,000 tribes. Left alone, They would have grown up thinking themselves mad, and even if they realized their powers, they'd have gone to great danger learning to control them all by themselves. So, until a month ago, every time such a child was born, the merwizards of Trapananda would know. And when the child was old enough to know language and basic skills, they came for him and took him along with any memories the tribe had of his existence. The process was cruel and imperfect, for some had retained memories and led to doubt their own sanity, but at the time we thought it was the only way. I was one such child myself, from this very place, and when I was taken, I was angry at them. But when I understood what's at stake, I accepted it had to be done, for I have learned who we are. They all spoke at one now. World's end draws near, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall lead none of the 1,000 tribes and win no glory in their eyes. I shall live and die at my post. I am the hand in the darkness. I am the watcher in the deep. I am the fire that burns against cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of the living. I pledge my life and honor to Trapananda for this day and all the days to come. The familiar-looking one spoke again. I am Earth's, son of Raga, of Sargashus, and I return to you at the turn of the tide to offer our help to the city of my birth. If you allow us, Elder Shaga, we would like to open a school here for the half-wizards among our people, from this city and possibly from beyond. We would also be happy to help your people with upgrading your food supply system and many more aspects of your life, to raise their standards of living to that of Roctorattle and above. All we ask in return is peace in the school and respecting our secrecy, for even as we come out of hiding to help our magicless kindred into a new age of prosperity, others would seek to control us and limit our powers out of blind hate and ignorance. I speak, of course, of the surfacers, and though we have no ill will towards them, we're very glad to see none of them are here, and we'd appreciate if it stayed so. Chapter 391, Little Miss Big Mouth. Monday, October 14, 1996 MS. Connors' third-grade classroom winship elementary school Brighton, United States of America Atlantis DEFCON status. 509% Petunia Searden, ni Piant Senaltry, was slowly getting accustomed to interacting with the other children at her school. She was still well behind her classmates when it came to mastery of the English language. However, the nice people who lived underneath the reservoir in central Massachusetts had given her language lozenges, which helped do a lot of the translations for her. The language lozenges could teach her English, as well as the instructors in some cases. The sound produced by the lozenges seemed more accurate than the words spoken by the teachers. She couldn't imagine the teachers not being able to speak English. However, it sure seemed like that was the case. The language lozenges seemed to all be in agreement that the large vehicles the Muggles drove around in were known as cars. The teachers, however, pronounced the word without the R. Cars. The teacher was really stupid, she thought. However, her parents had told her not to correct the teacher as that would not be polite, and for the most part, the teachers knew more than she did. She had been pretty aloof during her first days at the new school, and her parents eventually encouraged her to bring Tarla, her stuffed unicorn, over to school to cheer her up. Tarla had proven extremely popular among the other girls, as she was the only stuffed animal able to walk around on her own, which she found very amusing. The other girls' toys were so stupid. Their various dolls and stuffed animals just sat there and didn't do anything. Within a week of her arrival, she had become one of the more popular students in the class and had visited the houses of Kayla, Brittany, Caitlin, and several other people. Life was not perfect, however. For some reason, she remembered few details of her life prior to arriving in the Boston area, and when she had asked her parents, they had stared sharply at each other and claimed that they didn't know how they'd gotten here either. That didn't make sense, of course. Her parents were supposed to know and be able to fix everything. She suspected that fairies and wizards had been involved. They were running around all over the place here, and she found them scary for some reason. As she had left the room, she heard her mother mention something about childhood traumatic stress disorder and amnesia. She wasn't sure what those words meant, however. For some reason, the thought of wizards filled her with dread and made her think about the odd tattoo on her forehead. She didn't understand why, however. Most of the wizards she had met in Boston had seemed friendly, yet what made her not trust them? There were no wizards around her now, however, just muggle boys and girls like her. Everything was behaving as she would have expected, with nothing floating or flying around. The only magical object she trusted was Tala, who was busy passing notes under the desk to Brittany, a few desks away. The teacher glanced at the unicorn and frowned. Petunia, can you put her away? This isn't the right time to be playing with her toys. Petunia shrugged. I tried to put her away. She jumped back out again and told me she wanted to play. Can you put her in your desk at least? She looked at the desk. She doesn't like the dark down there. The teacher thought for a second, then suddenly smiled. All right, you win. However, I've got to see this. Can I play with her for a second? I'll take very good care of her. Petunia's eyes widened and she grinned. Sure. Hey, Tala, Ms. Connors wants to say hi to you. The unicorn wagged her tail and bounded towards the teacher, babbling something excitedly in Siadani. Grinning, she picked up the little animal, petted it a little, and showed it a toy. Tala naturally started messing around with it, and initially didn't complain that much when the teacher put her and the toy in a desk drawer and closed it. That didn't last, however, as the stuffed animal suddenly started complaining she couldn't see. The teacher, of course, did not know Siadani, so she wouldn't have known to let Tala out anyway. Petunia fumed at the teacher. She was such a jerk. Ignoring the laughs among the children and the irritated noises coming from the desk, she walked over to a projection device and showed everyone a wizarding map of the world. All right, kids, today we're going to have a geography lesson. This is the latest map of the world, complete with the known wizarding lands. We've got students whose parents come from countries all over the world here, so let's go through the room and tell everyone where we're from. We'll all point out our home countries on the map and talk about our cultures. Some of us may seem different from each other, but when push comes to shove, we're all people. Petunia looked at the map. She knew a little about geography, but not much. She knew that the Atlantic Ocean had two countries in it, Círdan and Nestor. There was a third Muggle nation in the North Atlantic called Iceland, which probably had lots of ice on it. Oddly enough, the map had Iceland and Nestor marked out. Círdan, however, was labeled as part of Nestor. Well, she thought, she'd get to teach the Muggles something. She could be the teacher for once, which could even give her the authority to go to the desk and release Tala. Something odd occurred to her, something about her not being allowed to tell the Muggles about Círdan unless her parents told her that it was okay. She thought about it for a moment and smiled. Telling her friends about Círdan was all right here, she supposed. After all, everyone else was telling her about their backgrounds. She was 9 years old. She was a big girl now, and she figured she was grown up enough to make the right decision here. The first person walked to the front of the room and pointed at the map. Hi, I'm Quinn, T-letter 1EA5T Hyen, and my parents are Vietnamese. This is Vietnam over here. My mom came over here as a child when a big fight broke out in Vietnam and she tried to run away. My uncle claims that he was involved in the big fight and helped rescue my mom. Petunia watched as he described what life was like in Vietnam. The little boy was followed by Boston-raised Brittany, a Mexican boy named Francisco, and a Haitian kid with dark skin who came from a port of princes. The teacher put little flags in the map for each child, and the class applauded enthusiastically after each talk. Finally, it was her turn. She walked to the front of the room and frowned as the teacher blocked her access to the crying Tala. I'm sorry, Petunia. You can play with her after school. Classes come first right now. However, look to the bright side. You can tell us all about yourself now. Somewhat relieved, she walked over to the map. Hi, I'm Petunia Círdan, and I come from the state of Círdan. For some reason, the nice people at the customs agency named me after my country. She pointed at the map. The map is all messed up. For some reason, they think Círdan is part of Nestor. It's not. It's its own country. The teacher whistled. Wow, are you actually from one of the wizarding nations? Petunia nodded. Yes, ma'am. But you're not a witch, are you? No, ma'am, I'm not. On Círdan, the wizards are bad people, and they beat up on people who aren't wizards. The teacher frowned. That's awful. Why would they do that? Petunia shrugged. I don't know. Maybe they should play games more and learn to like each other. The teacher hesitated for a moment, then let it out. Your last name matching the country, your unusual language. Good grief, are you? Refugees. Petunia blinked at her. What's a refugee? Someone who ran away from a country which they were afraid of. Petunia suddenly had a vivid memory of her trying to float away on a makeshift raft with her parents. It must have been suppressed for some reason. The vision scared her, but she tried to be a big girl. Maybe. I just had a vision of me, my mom, and my dad trying to leave the island on a little boat on June 20th. On June 20th, lots of crazy things happened, and a lot of the people ran away. The teacher jerked back and put her hands to her mouth. Judgment Day, and the lower classes escaped in the confusion. My God. The Mexican kid raised his hand, and the teacher called on him. Is this Círdan a city in Cuba? I heard lots of people from Cuba try to come to the US on rafts. The teacher chuckled and pointed at the map. No, Francisco, Círdan is not part of Cuba. Cuba is here, and Círdan is here. But my father said the important people in Cuba are bad people. They're colored red for some reason, and my father says everyone colored red is bad. The teacher laughed louder. They're not bad, Francisco. The president just used to disagree a little with the people in charge of Cuba. The vast majority of Cubans are nice people, just like the rest of us. I suppose these people from Círdan are nice as well. Petunia frowned. Sort of. The Muggles are nice, but the wizards are scary. I vaguely remember them doing bad things to me, but I can't remember what exactly they did. The teacher looked at the map for a long time. Finally, she pointed at the map and turned back to Petunia. Is Círdan associated with Nestor at all? Petunia shook her head. No, ma'am. Círdan has bad wizards who like to beat up on Muggles. Nestor has lots of pretty girls who can turn into scary birds. When I grow up, I want to be a pretty girl and turn into a bird as well, but I don't want to be a scary one. Why is Círdan not marked on the map as its own state then? Petunia grinned. The wizards are probably stupid and forgot to tell the map people. We know they're stupid because they don't like us. The teacher thought some more, then her eyes widened. Wait a minute, has Círdan announced itself to the Muggles yet? If they're not out, that would explain why the map is wrong, especially if the Muggles labeled it. Petunia shrugged. I don't know, ma'am. The teacher continued her train of thought as she talked to herself. If the wizards suppress the Muggles in Círdan, of course they won't come out because they know the rest of the world would obliterate them once they found out about it. We're talking war crimes on a huge scale here, with the majority class being persecuted. Hell, it's like apartheid. Petunia didn't understand the big words very well. However, the teacher seemed shocked and disturbed. She watched as the teacher jotted down some notes. Gently, the teacher knelt down and looked at Petunia. Did the wizards hurt you at all in Círdan? Is that why you left? Petunia shook her head. I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't remember many of the details. How did you get that mark on your head, Petunia? Petunia looked at the floor. A wizard gave that to me. His name was Altry. He was very scary. He scarred your head. How awful. Another memory came back. My mother said he owned me. He thought I was his property. This mark on my head is his sign. The teacher jerked back several feet in shock. Wait a minute. Are you saying that the wizards enslaved the Muggles in Círdan, and they branded you with their marks much like we do to cattle? Enslaved. Made them work hard for them. for little or no pay. Petunia winced. I can't remember anything of that, Ms. Connors. I'm sorry. There was silence in the classroom. Finally, Brittany raised her hand. I don't know about you, but I think we should tell these wizards to stop beating up on Muggles. Either that, or tell our parents to tell Guard and the President to beat up on the wizards and have them not hurt the Muggles. The teacher glared at Brittany. Brittany, remember people like Radner and Hermione Granger. Not all wizards are bad. But these wizards seem bad. Maybe these Círdan wizards are associated with the bad wizard who nearly blew the world up. The teacher reeled. A tie between Círdan and Voldemort. God help us. If that's the case, I agree with you, Brittany. Something needs to be done, and we need to figure out how. Chapter 392. Crabbe and Goyle actually plan something. Tuesday, October 15, 1996, Slytherin Common Room Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizards United Kingdom Atlantis, DEFCON status. 410% Vincent Crabbe turned Gregory Goyle and nodded. All right, Greg, I'll do it. I'm in. Goyle nodded. It's good to have a friend at a time like this, and now's the time to do it when the school's still going nuts over the attack. Do you want to see if Draco wants to get involved? Crabbe looked down the hall at Draco and slowly shook his head. I'm not sure if we can trust him anymore, Greg. He's been spending too much time with Flitwick and so forth for our tastes. Whatever he saw in London must have really addled his brains. Add to that the fact that the Death Eaters killed his adopted father. Goyle snorted. Good riddance. The man was a blood traitor in the end, and we even trusted him. Crabbe disagreed. He was much more of a Death Eater than this Slughorn fellow is. Bloody hell, Slughorn brewed that Felix Felicis to help take out all the Dark Lord's men in. Where is that country, Greg? North Korea, Vince. However, let's stay on task here. If we do want to get in touch with this new Death Eater cell, how do we do it? Hogsmeade is crawling with dementors, and there are auras everywhere. If we send any message out, it's bound to be intercepted. I'd say that we wait and gauge Draco's interest. He's smarter than both of us put together. If Draco can lead our cell, we can actually get somewhere here. He's not going to get involved, Greg. Bloody hell, I hope we don't have to kill him. I hope so as well. However, think positive. Maybe the attack will cause Draco to come to his senses. In the meantime, we should try to do something which will convince this new cell to let us in even though we're underage. That's not a bad idea, Greg. What exactly did you have in mind? Goyle grinned. I happened to overhear the teachers saying that in order to get the Dark Lord back, we need to get the Elder Wand, a resurrection stone, and an invisibility cloak. The purpose of the attack was to gain our side the Elder Wand, and that appears to have succeeded. We can't do anything about the resurrection stone right now, as I'm not even sure what a resurrection stone is. However, we both know someone with an invisibility cloak who lives in this castle. And unless I'm very badly mistaken, Draco would give us award after award if we did anything to irritate that cloak's owner. Crabbe's grin was vicious. You want to steal the cloak from Potter and possibly kill him. Goyle nodded. I doubt we'll be able to kill him without getting into big trouble. However, if we just happen to misplace that invisibility cloak so that it winds up in the hands of our new Death Eater friends, that could come in quite handy when it comes to our initiation. And who knows, an accomplishment like that could change Draco's mind. Madame Pomfrey nodded, and Harry drew a deep breath and walked into the hospital wing. Although most of the people who had been injured in the attack on the astronomy tower had been dismissed from the hospital, there were 3 people left. One of them was Cho Chang, the first girl Harry had ever kissed. Harry had to admit that he saw Cho more as a friend than a possible significant other now. After all, he and Ginny were now a steady couple. Nevertheless, the first kiss was a major milestone in a boy's life. Cho had survived the fall from the astronomy tower, but had landed in a way which had damaged her spine and partially paralyzed her. Despite all of Madame Pomfrey's help, it was increasingly obvious that she was going to have to learn how to walk all over again. She was spending most of her time taking baby steps around the infirmary under the watchful eyes of the nurse. Sometimes she took lessons with Professor Hawking, who was also trying to learn how to walk once more. Cho smiled weakly. "Hi there, Harry. How are you doing?" Harry forced a grin. He didn't like seeing anyone like this. "All right. The school is slowly getting back to normal, though the grief counselors are still going to be around for a while. I can't believe so many people are dead. I mean Hannah Abbott, Susan Bones, Padma Patel, Zacharias Smith. More students and staff died in this one attack than on Judgment Day. How are your lessons coming?" "All right. I made it halfway across the room today, though Wayne Hopkins gets today's recuperation award, as it looks like he's going to be able to see again. Professor Hawking seems to be getting accustomed to his cane, though I have no idea how he's going to make it up all those stairs. Which reminds me, how is he as a teacher?" Harry grinned. "I'm not taking astronomy notes, Cho. However, Hermione raves about him. I haven't seen her as crazy about a professor since Lockhart. She claims he's a very famous scientist in the Muggle world. I wouldn't know, however." "Neither would I, Harry. Neither would I. What about Hugh DeLord? How's he doing?" "Hugh seems to have taken some lessons from both Dr. and Mrs. Flamel. He's an excellent teacher, though he tends to switch to what sounds like Middle French when he's flustered. George Weasley is thinking of having Ron feed him a joke language lozenge, which will purportedly convert Middle French into English, but will actually convert it into Pig Latin or a series of expletives, depending on the phase of the moon." Cho chuckled. "Clever, but won't Ron get into trouble for that?" "No, the lozenge will immediately explain that it's George and not Ron who did it. Ron should be safe." "I see. How's Dumbledore doing?" "According to Flitwick, he's almost ready to leave the hospital. However, Dumbledore had a discussion with some of the doctors, and they've recommended that he just retire. He lost many of his memories when that bullet hit him in the head, and he wouldn't be as good a lecturer headmaster as he was before the incident. If he retires like this, we'll remember him as he was in his prime and not as a shadow of his former self." "I see. Is he going to get a portrait in the headmaster's office once he officially retires? I've been told there's no portrait of him up there yet. We've got Umbridge, Snape, and McGonagall, but no Dumbledore." "There's a good reason, Cho. He's still alive. The portraits only show up when the headmaster dies." "Are Umbridge and McGonagall still screaming at each other in Flitwick's office?" Harry nodded. "Judging from the magical ear protection Flitwick wears in his office, I believe so. McGonagall should have had more portraits made of her while she was in school. As it is, she can't leave this one. Umbridge, of course, is stuck in her frame because all of her portraits were in the Ministry of Magic, which got blown up." Cho grinned evilly. "It seems they'll have a long time to iron things out. I hope Flitwick gets work done at some point. National Malwashington, D.C. Miriam Coleman looked at the base of the Rock-to-Rattle obelisk, where the merpeople had conveniently provided a translation of all of the text on the obelisk. Her granddaughter's friend Brittany had told all of her friends that there was a wizarding nation on the map which did bad things to Muggles. She had claimed it was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, to the southwest of Nestor. Skeptical about this claim, she figured she'd drive over to D.C. and take a look. The obelisk was pretty tall and covered with runes and unfamiliar pictures. The map did have an island in the middle of the Atlantic to the southwest of Nestor. It was labeled as Frisland on the map. That didn't mean much, however, as the island known as Nestor had been labeled Winera. Very interesting. She continued making her way around the base of the statue and saw that someone had attached a second map, this one made out of parchment, to the bottom of the statue. The note next to the map claimed that this was a modern wizarding map taken from a Xyland schoolbook. The countries' names weren't in straight English. They were in an archaic dialect of some sort, but they were close enough. Nister, Lilliput, Brobdingnag, Yetalis, Festendry, Xylenda. She took a good look at the Atlantic Ocean on the second map. There appeared to be a mountain range right down the middle of the ocean, and the land marked as Friesland seemed to be situated right on top of it. It looked a lot like Iceland in that respect. Next to it was a small word with a question mark handwritten after it, certain. She frowned. She had been told the country where the wizards beat up on the Muggles had been called Círdan. There could be truth to this rumor after all. If that were the case, she'd better tell her congressman and the Secretary of Magic. She didn't want a country which suppressed Muggles so close to the East Coast. Determined to do something to help, she compared the two maps a little further. Most of the other nations had already been identified. However, there were a few other locations on the Xyland map which she hadn't known about. Perhaps the most astonishing was something which appeared to be a small nation called Silesia, in the middle of Antarctica. She didn't like the idea of an Antarctic nation at all. If you were a wizard who wanted to subjugate Muggles and felt like setting up a secret base somewhere, where would you go? Obviously, you'd want to go somewhere where people bereft of magic would fear to tread right. She picked up the phone and started calling her own friends. People needed to do something about these two new threats as soon as possible. Chapter 393, March of the Penguins. Wednesday, October 16, 1996, Santorini Sea Atlantis, DEFCON status 4/1. 1% Mikhailo Alexievich, Kohut had not let the letter out of his sight ever since it came in the mail. He'd nearly shoved the owl back out the window before his wife cautioned him that it could actually be from Atlantis International Confederation of Warlocks, 1 October 1996. Dear Mr. Kohut, it is my great pleasure to inform you that you have won one of the opportunities to move to Atlantis. Everything has been prepared for your arrival, and you can move in whenever you wish. Your new home on Atlantis will be determined by lot once you arrive, and you choose between two sets of homes, an all-Muggle section and a mixed Muggle-Wizard section. You will be allowed to transport as many personal items as you want. Thanks to the charms involved in devices like the Extendatant, a building which seems like a small apartment can be actually quite spacious. You will not have any trouble finding room for your belongings. This invitation is valid for you, your spouse if you have one, and any children under the age of 17 living at your current address. Pets are permitted as long as they are registered with our staff. Atlantis is currently on the surface and plans to stay above sea level for the foreseeable future. The climate is similar to that of Santorini and the other Aegean islands, hot and dry in the summer, mild in the winter. If you find this uncomfortable, do not worry as your home has magical climate control similar to Muggle air conditioning. In the unlikely event that Atlantis is forced to submerge, the city will be enclosed in a magical dome of air maintaining a constant 21 degrees centigrade, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You will still be allowed to maintain your Muggle citizenship while on Atlantis. The government has ruled Atlantis to be neutral ground when it comes to national territory, both Muggle and wizarding. All you will need to obtain before traveling to Atlantis will be a valid passport. If you choose to take advantage of this opportunity, send this owl back with an acceptance letter. Include a piece of personal information about a member of your party to be used for a security check. When you are ready to begin your move, please travel to Santorini, where we have set up a temporary embassy and customs house. Once we have verified your identity through magical means, each member of your party will be issued a resident card, which will allow travel to and from the island and entrance into your new home. I hope you join us on Atlantis. We are very interested in learning more about the Muggle world, and I assume that you are interested in learning more about us. Once again, congratulations, and I hope to hear from you soon. Best wishes. Hadar Daghergrand, Mugwump International Confederation of Warlocks. Anastasios Dialonisgrand Mugwump, Emeritus Wizarding, Ambassador to the United Nations Kohut, and his wife had celebrated with a tremendous glass of champagne, and sent back the owl with the acceptance letter. There had to be magic involved here. Whoever had sent the letter must have cast a spell on it so it would come out in Ukrainian instead of whatever language the wizards spoke. What was that? Latin. They had eventually decided to use the Atlantis apartment as their winter home. The climate seemed much more palatable than northern Ukraine. It didn't even snow down in Atlantis. They had spent a couple of weeks making sure their passports were up to date and packing up whatever they needed. Finally, the day had come. The flight and boat cruise had taken longer than they had hoped, but they had made it over to Santorini. Kohut could see the fabled city off in the distance, and he could only wonder what awaited him there. There were two other people in the waiting room, a man and a woman who appeared to be in their 30s. They smiled when they saw Kohut and congratulated him and his wife on their lottery win. Kohut was amazed to find that they spoke perfect Ukrainian, which was an even better boost. He hoped he would wind up living near these other Muggles at some point. Hopefully, someone would figure out what the wizards were saying. The man laughed and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kohut, but we're not Muggles. We're actually wizards who are minding the store here and reporting back when people show up. That's why we know your language, our magic, does the translation for us. Now, if you will excuse us, we'll head back to Atlantis and make sure someone comes to pick you up." Kohut nodded. "Go ahead, sir. I can't wait." The two people vanished, and Kohut turned to his wife. "These people seem very nice, and they've even gone out of their way to find a Ukrainian translator for us. This is going to be perfect." His wife nodded and clapped her hands. "I can't wait until we see them cast spells in front of our faces. I know apparition counts, but I'm hoping to see them pull a rabbit out of a hat or something like that." They didn't have to wait long. Seconds later, he heard someone in a raspy voice whisper two words, "Avada Kedavra." The green beam hit him, and that was that. His wife fell less than a second later. Halina Zyganova watched as the two Muggles slumped to the ground. They had to act fast before the real Atlantean welcoming committee showed up. She watched as her husband plucked some hairs from each of the Muggles' heads, stripped the bodies, and transfigured the corpses into a couple of small rocks, which he tossed out the open window into the street. He then dropped the woman's hair into a vial of polyjuice potion and gave it to her. Less than a minute later, they had taken the forms of the two Muggles. Zyganov started rummaging through the dead Muggles' stuff. "All right, Halina, find their passports. Let's see what our names are going to be." Zyganova nodded and leafed through the woman's purse. "Looks like I'm Lyudmila Kohutovna. You." "I'm Mikhailo Alexievich Kohut. Drat, this guy is supposed to be 29. How the hell am I going to pass for 29 once this polyjuice wears off?" Zyganova shrugged. "Hey, if I could pass for 26, I'd be more than happy. In all seriousness, you won't have to most of the time, Genya. I suspect we can get by with our normal looks as long as someone doesn't ask us for a passport." Her husband frowned. "I hope so, Halina. Let's hope this residency card doesn't have our faces on it, because it's going to have these two guys' faces." They dragged all of the clothes and Muggles' equipment into a side chamber, where they changed clothes. Dressed as the Kohuts, the Zyganovs managed to make it out of the side chamber just in time to see a wizard walk into the room. The wizard, a man in his 50s, waved to them. "You must be the Kohut family. Welcome to Atlantis. I'm Wizard Radika, and I'll be helping you with your move. First, a bit of security details. Can I see your passports, please, along with one other form of identification?" Hoping this would work, Zyganova and her husband handed over the passports. Radika checked them out and nodded. "They seem to be authentic to me, Mr. and Mrs. Kohut. There's one more thing we need to check, however. There's something called the polyjuice potion, which allows people to infiltrate an organization by taking someone else's form. That's why I asked you for a security question. With that in mind, what was the name of Irina's first boyfriend?" Zyganov swore to himself. He was hoping to not have to do this, but he had no choice. Turning to Halina, he asked, All right, Ludmilla, that's your sister. Let's embarrass Arena in public. To Zyganov's great relief, Radica fell for it. The Atlantean turned to look at Halina, giving Zyganov a chance to blast Radica with a Petrificus totalis when he wasn't looking. Having learned some mental magic from Rasputin, he planted a false memory in Radica's head, which helped convince him that the cohorts had successfully passed screening. This was immediately followed by an obliviation of the fact that Radica had been hexed in the first place. Radica blinked in confusion for a moment, then shook his head and smiled. Sorry about that, Mr. and Mrs. Cohut. I got confused for a second there. At any rate, you seem to be who you claim to be. Let me take your picture for the residency cards. Just a second. Radica brought out a camera as Zyganov tried to figure out what he was going to do. Finally, it occurred to him. Take the residency card and forge the data. He could always buy a magical camera on Atlantis somewhere, take pictures of their real faces, and attach them to the cards. The two wizards smiled as Zyganov took their picture. All right, then. Now, if you'll come with me, I'll fly you over to Atlantis. I'll bet you never thought you'd be flying on a broom, right? Zyganov smiled. He made a mental note to start gambling with this guy. 5 hours later, they were in their new home in Atlantis. It had been very, very close. However, they'd made it through the screening procedures and were in the process of doctoring their residency cards to cover up the pictures of the cohorts. The Black Guard was giving them luck, Zyganov mused. Radica had thoughtfully provided them with a magical telephone which would allow them to contact their friends on the mainland. Their phone number here at Atlantis was going to be 011*1-352. How convenient, Zyganov thought. Now he didn't have bother with owls or other familiars. Thankins Radica profusely. He had been so helpful, albeit with a little help from his charges. Zyganov called up Vovchenkaya. He spoke 2 words. We're in, awaiting orders from Rasputin or the Black Fist, Russian Ministry of Magic. The intern walked into the minister's office and saluted. Sir, we've put our agents into position in the Zyganov's town. If they're there, we'll catch them. Some of them are near the house itself. The minister frowned. You haven't seen them yet, even though you've been watching their house. Not, sir, but we're working on it. They've got to be around there somewhere. Keep me posted if anything changes, Oleg. Yes, sir. Salal Haushaws of Lake Tsalex Senate and People's Republic of Tsalasia Antarctica, being consul of Tsalasia, had been hard enough on its own, Serol thought. The magic maintaining the temperature shield had broken again the other day, and the dome had cooled to the point where the surface of Lake Tsalax had nearly frozen. Fortunately, the threat of exiling the atmospheric stability division to the surface had gotten the problem fixed pretty damn quickly. Yet that had been nothing compared to what Foreign Minister Tsorak had just dumped on her lap. Serol resisted the urge to throw the Foreign Minister into the lake. Are you sure about this, Foreign Minister? Tsorak sighed but nodded. I'm afraid so, Consul. The reports coming out of the United States and Zelenda seem to be very consistent. It appears that some idiot in Zelenda gave the American Muggles a map of the world from a school textbook. We're on it, and people in the United States are asking questions. Their Senate has found out about this as well, and Ariadne was caught completely off guard. She gave us a heads up less than half an hour ago. Serol growled. Wonderful. File a formal protest against Zelenda and start obliviating everyone. Tsorak threw his hands up. What good will that do, Consul? It's done, and I don't think we can stop this now. Besides, the Xyland have apologized profusely. That map is almost certainly on the Muggle information network called the Internet now, which means everyone on the planet can see it. If we're not forced out now, we will be at some point. I recommend that we come out now, on our own terms, though. The Foreign Minister paused. It was obvious there was something else he wanted to say, but was reluctant to. Serol, however, needed to know everything. All right, Tsorak, spit it out. What else? Wincing slightly, he coughed delicately. You know how our agents sometimes hang out on the surface for masquerading as penguins? Well, they've seen several indications that the Muggles have sent out an expeditionary force to visit us. Cyril's jaw dropped. What, how, who, when? They should be above us momentarily. They can't get through the ice cap, of course. However, it's obvious they're very curious. The party seems to be made up of large numbers of scientists from McMurdo, the South Pole Station, and a whole bunch of other research facilities on the surface. They're all meeting at Vostok Station and are going to head over here. The consul fumed. Why couldn't this have happened in the winter when no one was there? Sorek shrugged. Bad luck, madame. What do you want to do? Should we go up and meet them? Cyril thought for a moment. What do you think the odds are that they're going to make it down here? It may only be a matter of time, consul. I can already tell you that the Americans are getting very curious and are pressing for first contact. Once they get a wizard involved, it's over. There are also rumors that people are thinking of coming over from places like South Africa and Australia. The consul spat in a most unladylike fashion. More Brits, just what we need. I figured we can't trust any of those people. Sorek thought for a moment and slowly nodded. You may be right, consul. However, to be honest, Ariadne is doing us a favor here by warning us. She may come from a former British colony, but I suspect she's a decent person. Cyril was skeptical, but she could tell her options were limited. Quite possibly. However, we're going to be very careful here. I'm guessing there are a lot of folk who aren't going to be happy about. Suddenly, she broke out laughing. Círdan. Muggles finding out about Círdan. I suspect there's enough chaos going in Círdan at this point that they've thought another Judgment Day just hit. From what I've been told, the limited exposure the Círdani have already suffered nearly overthrew their society. Sorek grinned. I wouldn't be surprised, consul. At any rate, how do you want to handle this? Since this is an important diplomatic encounter, I recommend that we try to suppress our current opinions for the time being. The last thing we need now is a war with the white folk. Besides, who knows? With so little contact between us and the outside world, it's quite possible that our theories are completely unfounded. Cyril shrugged. Quite possibly. All right, here's what we'll do. I take it that they can't survive long out there. No, consul. I thought so. Here's what we'll do. Researcher Edwin Mueller looked around the windswept field of ice. This is where you guys said the lake was. Igor Zhukov nodded. That's it. The lake's there, all right. It's just that we've got this little ice cap in the way. If there is a country down there, you'd expect that they'd put it near the lake so they can get drinking water. Mueller scoffed. Drinking water, they can just lick the ice. And have their tongues freeze off. Get real. If I were them, I'd what the hell is this? Mueller spun, and his eyes widened when he saw what appeared to be the ghost of a penguin well, a penguin which was shining with a brilliant white light looking at him. It barked something at him in a language he didn't recognize. Frowning, he turned to Zhukov. That isn't Russian. Hell, I have no idea what it is. Any of the rest of you know. The rest of the scientists shrugged and shook their heads. Mueller was about to try sign language when there was a flash of light, and two people wrapped in roughly 8 layers of parkas materialized next to him. Zhukov shook his head in disbelief as Mueller tried to be diplomatic. Hello, gentlemen. Are you at Salesian? If we're trespassing on your land, I apologize, but we're just curious. One of the newcomers grinned and spoke with a woman's voice. I'm actually not Salesian, sir. I'm actually Katie Leonard, a special Muggle envoy from the Aboriginal Australian community. I'll help you talk to these guys. I'm accompanied by Wizard Poole here, who will serve as our guide and interpreter. Zhukov frowned. Special envoy. I can understand why we'd need an interpreter. What does this penguin speak, Linux? Leonard nodded grimly. Yes, special envoy. This penguin here, according to Wizard Poole, is a messenger sent by Consul Tsurul of the Senate and People's Republic of Tsalasia. She is the head of Tsalasia. Mueller scratched his head. What is this? Did Rome move down here when we weren't looking? Almost, sir. You see, this place is modeled after the Roman Republic. You may be aware that the various hidden nations have rather unusual forms of government. This nation is no exception. Poole cut in. Now, gentlemen, this is serious. Silesia has always had a bit of a problem with the Western world. Suffice it to say they've been hurt by Westerners in the past and are a bit wary of them. This is why Katie and I, a merry witch doctor, will handle first contact. You guys stay in the background. For the time being, we don't want any problems here. Mueller nodded very sharply. He wasn't a diplomat after all. He backed off, and most of the rest of the researchers followed him. Poole and Leonard looked at each other. Finally, Leonard drew a deep breath and turned to face the Penguin. Good afternoon, Madame Consul. My name is Catherine Leonard, and I am a Muggle from the Aboriginal tribes of Australia. Poole translated. The Penguin waited for a few seconds, and then blurted out a response, which Poole relayed back to the rest of the crowd. I am the patroness of Consul Tsurul of Silesia, and I have been sent by my mistress to welcome you to our land. How did you find out about us, Miss Leonard? A map we retrieved from the nation of Zelenda. Rest assured, we mean you no harm. The Penguin grunted. I figured as much, Miss Leonard. The first citizen is getting angry messages from virtually every single hidden nation. Have these Westerners harmed you at all? The researchers backed off a little further as both Poole and Leonard winced. Poole replied, Actually, Madame Consul, these so-called Westerners are researchers. They have come to Antarctica to study this frozen continent. You will find them to have much more open minds than the people you fled from a while back. You have no reason to fear us anymore. The Penguin hesitated. I hope that is the case. At any rate, let me describe my country. We have about 75,000 people, with about 30,000 wizards and 45,000 muggles. We live underneath the ice cap in a protective dome. The ice cap is actually fake, and there is a passage through the ice which can be opened by a wizard to reach our community. Our capital is Tsalax, and it is located on the shores of Lake Tsalax, a large freshwater lake here under the ice. Mueller couldn't help but cut in. Madame Consul, we are aware of the lake. Our Muggle sensors detected it, but we have no way to explore it. The Penguin looked worried. You discovered us through the ice cap. No, Madame Consul. We discovered the water and that was it. We assumed there was no civilization down there. As it is, we have no desire to interfere with your way of life. Leonard cut in. Madame Consul, it is rather cold out here. May we visit your community, where it's presumably warmer? We are unarmed, and if you wish, Wizard Poole will hand you his wand. All we are bringing with us are Muggle recording devices called cameras, which will show our world your way of life and how you live. We will not record anybody without their permission. The Penguin shook its head. I'm sorry, but we're not accustomed to having visitors down here. You're missing out on a lot, Consul. The world has changed since you left, and for the most part, it's become much less barbaric. You have no reason to hide from us anymore. Furthermore, since the statute of secrecy has fallen, Muggles and wizards have become working together for mutual good. The Penguin thought for a long moment. Finally, it nodded. All right, here's what we'll do. I will let Leonard, Poole, and 3 Muggle researchers with the video cameras into the city. The rest of you should stay at your base on the surface to keep warm. After you leave, our community will vote on whether we should let the rest of you in. If the vote comes out in your favor, we'll open up more. Leonard smiled. Thank you, Madame Consul. She turned to the researchers. Who here's got the cameras and who wants to visit? I'd recommend 1 person from each nation. There was a brief discussion, and Leonard eventually picked out Mueller, Zhukov, and someone from China. The Mari interpreter relayed this to the Penguin, and the Penguin nodded. This is acceptable. Wizard Poole, do you know how to get in? Poole nodded. Yes, Madame Consul. Good. Take them over to the entrance, and Preta Sandor will meet them there. Giddy with excitement, Mueller followed the wizard over to what appeared to be a crack in the ice, as the other researchers glumly walked back to the Vostok research station. He soon found out that it was far more than a crack in the ice.